Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to the YouTube channel. So it's been about 6 months since DJI decided to enter the world of FPV quads, and they released this guy, the DJI FPV drone. So now that it's been around 6 months and the hype has kind of died down around this drone, I thought I would make my long-term review for what it's actually been like owning the DJI FPV drone and give you guys my honest thoughts on how it fits into my workflow, how I use it every single day, and what I actually think about this drone now that I've actually gotten the chance to put it through its paces. So let's get into that right now. Now, when I initially got this drone, I was extremely excited. It was the first FPV drone that I had ever purchased, and to date, it's actually still the only FPV drone that I own. I had seen so much amazing footage online of pilots like Johnny FPV and others capturing this incredible footage using FPV drones, and I couldn't wait to do the same myself. Where I live, there's actually these towers called the Absolute Towers that are shaped like Marilyn Monroe, and I couldn't wait until I had the skills and the confidence to be able to dive these massive buildings and get some amazing looking footage. Bit of a spoiler alert, I still haven't done that dive, and let me explain why. So when I first started flying the DJI FPV drone in full manual, I quickly came to a realization. The camera on this drone is like a potato. Unfortunately, it's just not good. Yes, it records in 4K 60, but honestly, the 1/2.3 inch CMOS sensor is just not good. It records in a flat profile, yes, but the stabilization that it uses is the same as the rock steady stabilization used on the DJI Osmo Actions, and it's honestly just passable at best. And what this meant was that in order to get really good smooth footage like you see out of GoPros on traditional FPV drones, you had to fly really smoothly, meaning that you had to become a really good FPV pilot. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The drone definitely trains you to be a good FPV pilot, but getting really good footage out of this drone just started to become very difficult. And also, as a bit of a minor complaint, I found that this camera really crushes the shadows, and there's very minimal detail in there, and I like to sort of lift the shadows when I edit and look at video. So that was kind of a bummer for me, and just added to the qualities of the camera that were just not good. So this not so great camera started a very interesting trend when I started flying the FPV drone. I found that I wasn't hitting the record button. I was actually just using this drone in real life to sort of practice flying in full manual and learning how to fly an FPV drone. And this kind of led me to problem number 2. This drone is really expensive. For the whole package, the goggles, the controller, and the drone, in Canada, you have to pay around $1,600, and I think that's before tax. And then you gotta add on a couple $100 if you plan to get DJI Care, if you don't wanna try and repair it yourself in case you crash. So that's a lot of money. And basically, when I was flying, I was afraid that I was gonna crash. So I wasn't taking any risks. I was flying really carefully, just kind of flying high, not trying to fly through anything, because I was like, hey, if I crash this drone, I don't wanna spend a ton of money to fix it and then maybe just crash it again and then sort of have to go through the whole process. So the cost of this drone was always kind of stuck in my head and really held me back from exploring those really super dynamic FPV shots that I really wanted, which is kind of the whole reason that I bought the FPV drone. So because of these two factors, the camera sucking and the drone being very expensive, I actually didn't have a place for the DJI FPV drone in my workflow. So I visited Hawaii and I took this drone with me, and I only flew it once. That's right, literally only once. I lugged it all the way from Canada to Hawaii. It took up a ton of space in my bag, and I only flew it once. That definitely says a lot if you ask me. So because of my fear of crashing, I wasn't getting any dynamic shots, and the footage didn't look good, and it was poorly stabilized. So it was just a lot of bad things. The only silver lining was that, hey, I'm finally learning how to fly FPV, and that definitely meant something to me. Now, 2 things have happened recently that kind of changed my mind about those 2 problems that I spent the beginning of this video talking about. The first thing was that, yes, I finally crashed the DJI FPV drone straight into a tree. But to my surprise, there was actually no damage on the drone. The props were fine, the body was fine. I flew it again immediately and it flew perfectly fine. And then a week later, I crashed into a tree again. And once again, there was no damage on the props, no damage on the body, and it flew again perfectly fine. So that was the moment that I realized that I actually hadn't given DJI enough credit for how sturdy they've made this drone. The drone can kind of take a decent beating and keep flying. And then it was that moment that something switched in my brain, some kind of switch flipped, and I decided that, hey, I'm not gonna be scared anymore. I'm gonna try and push this drone as hard as I can. And if it breaks, it breaks. Whatever, I have DJI care. I should try and make use of it somehow. So I started to fly through things and around things, and I was starting to get pretty good at FPV, and I was starting to get much closer to those dynamic FPV shots that I had first envisioned when I had actually bought the DJI FPV drone. Now that I was finally starting to get good at FPV, there was still one glaring problem, and that was the fact that the camera sucked. So I finally gave in and I decided to mount a GoPro on the DJI FPV drone. And I'm not gonna get into that too much in this video because this is about the DJI FPV drone itself without any modifications or anything like that. But what I will say is that the footage from the GoPro so far has been pretty phenomenal and kind of solved all my complaints about the camera issues. So after 6 months, those are the two main problems that I've noticed with the DJI FPV drone. It's an expensive drone to crash, which can sometimes hold you back, and you kind of have to let go of that fear and just accept that that's the fact if you're flying this drone. And the camera sucks, which you can't really do anything about unless you decide to mount a secondary camera on it, which is just a more expensive solution because you got to go out and buy an action camera and then you got to learn how to mount it and so forth, which, like I said, I'll discuss in another YouTube video. Now, there is one more con with this drone, and I feel like most people won't care about this, but it's something that has bothered me, and that's DJI's lack of support for this drone. And let me explain real quick. So when the drone first came out, they promised a bunch of updates and features that should have come, and it's been about 6 months and we haven't heard anything. So one of those features was actually cinematic mode. So that was going to be the ability to shoot video in 24 or 25 frames per second, just so we can get that slower shutter speed and get those more cinematic type shots. And that still hasn't come to the DJI FPV drone. There's been no update and there's been no word. And that's a little disappointing because that just shows you that the DJI FPV drone is pretty low on DJI's priority list and that the launch might not have gone as successfully as they had hoped, which means that DJI in the future might be backing out of making more FPV quads and they might just stick to the digital system. Again, that's not fact or anything. This is just my thoughts on what I think based on the lack of support that the drone has received from DJI. But I could be wrong, who knows? And as long as they keep making the digital system, that's all that really matters, because it is absolutely phenomenal and probably the best digital system on the market for FPV drones. Okay, so now that I'm finally done complaining, let's get to all the good things about this drone. There is a reason why I decided to mount a GoPro on it instead of going out and actually purchasing a traditional FPV quad. And the first thing is probably the GPS on this thing. I love that it can self-hover. It's so easy for you to launch the drone, take off, let it hover, and then switch it to manual mode, and then doing the exact same thing just in reverse when you're landing. You can actually hand catch this drone so easily because of the GPS positioning. Also, the best thing about the GPS positioning is that if you ever lose signal or lose connection with your goggles or your controller when you're flying, the drone will actually stop, it'll hover, it'll sort of look for that return to home point like a traditional DJI drone would do, and then it would fly back to you. If you have a traditional FPV quad and you lose connection, that thing is just gonna fall right out of the sky. So this is one of the best features of the DJI FPV drone, and it makes it really attractive for beginners because I've flown behind like trees or like a building sometimes and like really far, and the drone just loses connection completely and it would fly back to me. And if it was any other case, I would have lost the drone. So that's one feature that I definitely love about this. The second thing is that emergency brake button. And honestly, when I started to embrace this button for what it was, is when I really started to take more risks with the FPV drone, and when I started to get really good. I started to rely on it knowing that it would save me if I ever got in trouble. And basically what it does is that if you hit it, no matter what kind of orientation or what kind of position you're in, the drone will self-level itself, and then it'll hover in the area that it's in. It'll just completely stop. It's literally an emergency brake button that gets you out of trouble. And I think that's an amazing feature that DJI has added, and I use it a bunch. I use it when I just want to stop sometimes, just because I want to take a break, take a deep breath, and then get back into it, because FPV can be pretty exhausting. So I think this is probably my second most favorite feature about the DJI FPV drone, and I think it'll be very, very good for new beginners getting into the hobby. And finally, the last reason why I didn't ditch this drone is actually the battery inside of it. And I know that sounds a little weird, but the DJI FPV drone comes with smart batteries. So that means you can just plug it into its charger, plug it into a wall, and it'll charge normally. Traditional FPV quads use LiPo batteries, and those have a sort of a bad reputation for being kind of dangerous. They explode on people all the time, so there is that little bit of added risk, and I just didn't want to deal with that at the time. So I was like, hey, I'm gonna stick with my smart batteries. They're easy to charge, and I think they're also, again, super friendly towards beginners because they don't have to learn how to charge LiPo batteries or anything. It's very much plug and play. So I love the fact that this thing has smart batteries, and because of the DJI battery technology that they've integrated into this, you get crazy flight times. Like, I average around like 15 minutes of flight time for FPV, and that's pretty significant for this sport because traditional FPV quads only get around like 3 to 4 minutes per flight. So it's been pretty sweet flying this with 3 batteries for 15 minutes each, and then just being able to charge them really easily. I think it's been really good for me to spend as much as time possible in the air to continue to hone my skills and continue to get better with the FPV drone. But after 6 months of struggling to decide of if I hate this drone or not, and if I should sell it, and yes, I did think about selling it multiple times. It just didn't fit into my workflow because of how bad the camera was. I'm finally starting to see the potential of this drone and what it can do for my footage. Granted, I did have to mount a GoPro on it to sort of get around the bad camera quality issues, but it's finally starting to fit into my workflow in a way where I can see it being very, very useful, and I'm very excited to see what kind of footage I can get with it. Now, if you guys are interested in seeing how this whole GoPro mounting experiment is going and what the footage from that camera looks like when it's mounted on the FPV drone, stay tuned because I will be making a YouTube video on that really, really soon. I just sort of broke the mount, so I'm waiting for a new one to get delivered, but as soon as that comes in, that video will go up very shortly. Also, I may have bought a traditional FPV Cinewhoop, and I'm just waiting for that to come in. So if you guys are interested in a video on that, stay tuned because I'll definitely be making one on that as well. And that's it for this video, guys. So hopefully you guys learned something, and if you did, as always, please leave a like at the bottom of the video, smash that like button. It really helps out the video. If you guys enjoy drones, filmmaking, all that stuff, please subscribe to the channel. It'll definitely mean a lot to me. That's it for this video though. I'll see you guys in the next one, and until then, keep creating.